Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler for you, and today I'm going to be doing the first of a couple of episodes. This month is my birth month, May is, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to go ahead and take some time to talk about some about myself and share some of who I am. This is a way I think that I can help express sort of where I come from, where my thoughts are. So I wasn't entirely sure what things specifically to talk about, so I reached out to my patrons at my Patreon. I'll go ahead and plug it now. You can support me at patreon.com/Sientir, and you get a bunch of perks and stuff. To me, the most significant one is the daily audio logs that you get starting at $5, but I am digressing. So I asked my patrons for some suggestions of things to talk about, and I got a couple of really good suggestions. So this week, I think I'm going to go ahead and talk about the first one, which is different periods of my life or different sort of life events that have had an impact on me or helped form who I am, sort of my views on things, that sort of stuff. Basically formative events in my life. The next one, just to kind of tease you for next week, is the impact that media has had on my life, specifically more media. So that's going to be things like video games, books, movies, that sort of stuff. So they're very related topics, and I think they really fit into this theme that I wanted to kind of capture of what kind of forms my viewpoint. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with what sort of real-life events have kind of formed who I am. And the first one is indelibly who I was born to. So that's my parents, where I was born and grew up. And at this point, I'm living in the west coast of the United States of America, up in sort of the Seattle broader area. So I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana, and that sort of upbringing also was to a physician. So both of my parents, by training, are physicians, although my mom stopped working fairly early in my life to help raise us being me and my sister. And the events of my schooling definitely have had an impact on me, who my friends are. So there's a couple of significant early things. The first one is that we had a computer in my home fairly early, and I got into video games early from that point in time. Notably started with like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, playing those with my dad when I was like 6-ish, to give you some rough idea of my age. And that definitely had an impact on me. Just getting into video games that way is a very different trajectory. And so the games that I was exposed to is very different. In terms of, just to give a broad overview, my experience with console games initially was predominantly going over to a friend's house, playing Sonic the Hedgehog 3 at his house, and I have a lot of fond memories of that, and just spending time with my friends. It is through them that I got into things like computer programming and Pokemon, things that have had an enormous impact on my life. So it's always very interesting to kind of trace the thread of one's experiences. I myself didn't actually have a console that I gamed on until the N64. I got into it through GoldenEye, which I think is very interesting. But this is some of the early stuff that kind of formed the framework. So that got me into Nintendo, and ever since then I've always been kind of like a PC plus Nintendo sort of gamer. And this matters because it was through that I learned about DigiPen, which is the college that I went to. DigiPen Institute of Technology. I went there for their programming degree. So through my interactions with my friends, I got into programming. Through GoldenEye, of all things, I got into Nintendo. And that had a big impact on where I ended up there. The Pokemon thing was actually very significant because I ended up participating with both the card game in a way. It introduced me to people who are playing Magic the Gathering. I've learned so much about game design from Magic the Gathering that it's been very, very important, I think, that I was introduced to that game because of how much I learned from it, and also to some extent the friends that I made from it. But also, Pokemon got me, there's a Pokemon club that I participated at, and that had a huge impact on me long term because of the friends that I made through that. One in particular who has had such an enormous impact on a lot of worldview stuff, just from conversations that I've had with him over the years. But let's go ahead and rewind a bit, because that's a bit more recent. So, like I said, I was born to a particular set of parents, and so it was a very conservative area, a Christian home, as it were, or a Christian family. I have talked about this in the past in my testimony episode, but that got me interested in Christianity. I started reading my Bible semi-regularly, read it over breakfast, and that was important. My baptism was a significant event. I have a ring now that I wear on my right hand to commemorate that event. It is actually kind of a significant concept because the right hand is the hand of power or authority in a sort of traditional right-handed oriented cultural idea. But on the inside of the ring, I actually have the date of my baptism, which is August 22nd, 1999. That was a very important event and kind of set the stage for how things would progress. So there's a couple of things that kind of stand out in my mind. One of them was confronting a friend over some stuff that he was doing that I felt was walking away from Christianity, and talking with him about that. And it didn't go well, but that stepping out, I think, was an important event that I chose to do that. And then I went to DigiPen. I actually dropped out of high school to be able to do that. And that move has had a huge impact on my life in terms of a cultural sense and who I got to meet and interact with. So I come from a very conservative area, and I've had to reevaluate so many things because of the assumptions that are built into any given cultural sense. When you're transplanted from a very conservative worldview to an area that is full of a lot more of a liberal or a progressive worldview, it means that you have to kind of reevaluate, right? You're being pulled out of your bubble and being asked to reexamine things. So there's definitely a lot of underpinning of conservative ideas, but there's also a lot of liberal ideas that I have to kind of figure out how to make things kind of fit together and how I want to try to understand the world. So that whole sort of transition has been very influential on how I view things, because I have a certain default lens that I kind of work through, and I try to understand stuff through that lens, but I don't necessarily hold values quite the same way. So it's kind of an interesting blend. Like, I don't consider myself a libertarian because I think that government has a very important place, and I think that if you want free market solutions to work, and to some extent I think that they do, you also have to have stuff in place to ensure that there's a free market and that there's the transparency necessary and that there's the competition necessary to be able to have one. Because I think that inherently market forces try to push towards monopoly, and you have to be very careful of that. There's events I talked about last week with some of the naturism, nudism stuff and sexuality stuff that have had a lot of impact on me, quite a lot of impact actually on current worldviews and things like that. But something else that had a pretty big impact was a trip that my family took to Europe in 2013. So this trip was my first time ever going to Europe. I'd been to Japan previously, but that was not quite the same thing. This was a rather significant event for me. There's a couple of things, though, actually. Just speaking of that trip to Japan, that was when, I would have been about 16, I guess, on that trip. And when we went there, for me, there was a lot of, because there was a heat wave when we were there. And it was like, I remember this distinctly as like 40 degrees centigrade, or Celsius, I guess is more accurate. But I remember doing this sort of mental conversion to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was miserably hot. And I just remember before our trip to Europe that I didn't have a certain sort of intentionality. So when we went to Europe, I had an intentionality of, I want this to be memories, right? I want to really interact with and experience this place and not be caught up in my own head like I felt like I was when I was in Japan. So that trip to Japan informed how I approached our trip to Europe. And we went to Paris, Florence, and Rome over the course of about a 2-week trip. And we also took a bit of a day trip around when we were in Florence, I think it was, to visit like Siena and San Gimignano, a couple of different places around there. There's a lot of impact that I had from that, one of which was fresh gelato is amazing, and I really miss it. Although I'm sure it's probably better for me health-wise to not. But on the other hand, we walked a lot when we were there, and it probably would help me a lot if I were walking more often. But I digress. Probably the biggest impact was the art, combined with the weight of history. In the United States of America, we don't have human cultural stuff that has that weight of history to it. When you walk into Notre Dame Cathedral and you can feel the age of the stones, or St. Peter's Basilica, and you can feel how old it was, or see these paintings that are hundreds of years old. And it's just, the weight of history is incredible. And you might be able to have some of that on the East Coast of the United States, but you still don't even get back as far as some of the stuff in Europe. And walking through the Louvre, and that place is enormous, or Versailles. So there's a lot of art and aesthetic stuff that trip has had a huge impact on me. And that's also a place where my love for statues really kind of developed. I really like statues as an artistic medium because I really appreciate the three-dimensionality of them. And when we were there, actually, I got some smaller replicas of a few pieces. They are in my room where I can see them. And I like having those 3D pieces. And I appreciated also the approach that the art had, that it didn't shy away from the beauty of the human body and that sort of thing. And it was a very phenomenal experience for me. Just kind of rolling back a little bit as things kind of roll through my head. Another thing that's had a very big impact on me was my experiences through high school. Now, I was not particularly fond of it for a number of reasons. It's very immature, that sort of thing. And I did drop out so I could go to college, which was an interesting experience in and of itself. Took the GED because DigiPen accepted a GED. And why protract an experience I didn't like at all for no good reason if I could just go to college? So that's what I did. So I have my GED and I'm a high school dropout with my bachelor's degree. But one of the big things with high school that I really remember is being perpetually sleep deprived because I would go to sleep like midnight and wake up like 6:30 a.m. So I was always really, really tired. And I did not like waking up to the alarm clock. I did not like the experience of being tired all the time. And that's really informed things for me now. It's part of why I'm trying to do this podcast thing, this content creation, is because the hours are aggressively flexible. And that's really beneficial for me because having to stick to a strict schedule where I have to go to bed at a certain time, I have to wake up at a certain time, it doesn't work for me very well. It makes me fairly unhappy. So that's why I'm trying to do this content creation thing. So that's heavily informed life decisions that I'm making now because that experience through high school of being miserably sleep deprived all the time instructed me on what I didn't want. Something else, too, that's had kind of an impact on me was my experiences in college with being able to just interact with people, hang out, play Magic. That's something that I long for, that sense of community, but not a structured community, but kind of a disorganized community where you kind of just get together and it's like, oh yeah, there's people here to interact with. Let's do stuff together. So that's something that I really liked. And then I'd also be remiss if I didn't talk about my experiences with the church that I'm currently going to. We discovered it when I came out for a Project Fun workshop. So that's something that DigiPen runs kind of during the summer sort of time. And it gives you, for them, it's to some extent a marketing tool, but it gives people an opportunity to go in and take some lessons and learn about making games. And it was a really cool experience. I enjoyed it quite a lot. And that also confirmed that DigiPen was a real school, but it's also where we were introduced to the church that I go to now and have for the past 12 years or so. And I've had a lot of growth at that church, a lot of development with the people that I've met there and interacted with. So that's also had, for sure, a big impact on me and been a large point of growth. There's also a couple of other events that kind of stand out in my mind. Some interactions, I think I might have talked about them in my testimony video, but there was an interaction with one of the people. So I work with a video game startup company sort of thing. It was through them that we started doing podcasts together there, and that's part of what helps me realize that I could do podcasting on my own as well. So that's also had an impact on me. But one of the conversations I was having with one of the guys helped me realize that I was communicating to try to prove how clever I was, and that was not good and not what I wanted to be doing. So that moment, I had been prepared for it, and when it happened, I was in a place where I could step back and recognize, oh, I am not doing things the way that I really want to be or ought to be. So that was a very impactful moment for me. Another impactful moment was, and I may have talked about this in the testimony video as well, was when I realized that I was being very manipulative of a roommate of mine and not treating it. It's a very complicated situation I don't want to go into, but I was not treating my roommate very well and when they were going through a difficult time. And that's something that has definitely had an impact on my thinking and views as well. So there's been a lot of stuff throughout the years, and one of the things I think that consistently has had the biggest impact on me in many regards are sort of the people that I've ended up interacting with and communities that I've interacted with and what they care about and what they've been able to teach me from their perspectives. And it's learning from other people and other points of view that in many regards have shaped me, but there's also been a lot of situations that I've been able to experience that I'm very grateful for. So when I look at the through line of my life, there's just a lot of interweaving stuff. like, I think part of the thing that helped with the trip to Japan is we had several Japanese exchange students as a family. They're 1 month long sort of things through the 4-H fair. And those are part of what led to that trip to Japan, I think. And that helped formulate the way that I approached the trip to Europe. And also that I knew that I kind of wanted to wait until I was ready for that sort of trip, to when I could really appreciate seeing things for the first time. And so there's a lot of threads throughout my life that have been interconnected. And this whole talk has just been kind of going over a lot of those things that have formed my viewpoints that I hold now. And a lot of stuff has been a lot of thinking and analyzing stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there because this recording time is getting pretty long. And next time I will talk about how video game and other media consumption has impacted me. Until then, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. And I already plugged my my Patreon, but just to mention again, patreon.com/Sientir. Support is very greatly appreciated. You can also like me on Facebook at facebook.com/SientirsRamblers or contact me directly at sientir@gmail.com. Until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.